I think that probably the beginning is actually Charterhouse.
Yes, and it's, for me, it's pre-Genesis, because at Charterhouse I met a guy called Rivers Job, who he was way ahead of all of us, and he went on very early on to become a professional bass player with the Savoy Brown Blues Band. So he was part of the blues boom, you know, all the John Mayalls and all that lot. And he, from somewhere, got the idea. There was another band called the Wombats, and they were rehearsing, and they had a break, and I wanted to be a drummer, so I got behind. I mean, everyone did, didn't they? I got behind the drum kit and started thrashing around, and Rivers heard this, and for some reason got the idea that I was a drummer. And at his prep school before Charterhouse, he'd met Anthony Phillips, who wasn't yet at Charterhouse. And in the holidays, after Anthony left his prep school and came to Charterhouse, I met Rivers at Marble Arch, and we got on the number 30 bus, and we went to Ant's house in Putney. Now, the big difference between Ant and I and others is that my parents... My mother thought that Mick Jagger was literally the devil incarnate, and I thought he was the opposite. And so they very much resisted my love of what was going on in music at the time. So I was rather astonished to get to Ant's house and find that the dining room, the furniture had all been swept aside, you know, the Persian carpet rolled up, the oak table pushed, and all this equipment, and it was a rehearsal room, and plus a rudimentary drum kit, which I got behind, and Ant very quickly realised that Rivers had been wrong about my drumming talents. I hadn't done my 10,000 hours, you know, but one of the songs that we would, you know, people were going, well, what song should we do? You know, and one of them was a Stones B-side called Little by Little. Now, I had two elder sisters. My middle sister went to see the Stones in Richmond and Guildford and King, all those early days, and she brought back stuff, and I just absorbed it all. You know, I was 4 years younger than her. And I knew the words to the song, such as they were. So I started singing them, and Ant said, look, why don't you just sing and we'll find someone else to do the drumming. And he had a friend around the corner called Rob Tyrrell, and that was basically the beginning of Anon, which was the group that Mike Rutherford joined as well. So that's how it all started.
How did Mike get into this group?
Mike met Ant, and obviously their interest in guitar playing came up, and you know, I don't know whether Mike's housemaster had forbidden him to play, so Mike kept appearing and disappearing. You know, he would appear when he could, and then suddenly we'd have a rehearsal and Mike wasn't there, and he was locked in the house. You know, funnily enough, his house was called Lockheit's, but he was around enough, and obviously during the holidays and everything. And Mike was another one whose parents were fantastically supportive. You know, his mother later on, his mother would sit up all night listening to Radio Luxembourg, waiting for them to play a Genesis track, which they very seldom did, I have to say. But anyway, so he was a really good rhythm guitarist. So we had Ant, Mike on rhythm, Rivers bass, Rob Tyrrell drums, and me on the vocals. And we mostly did Stones covers. And we'd play at parties and dances and you know, just stuff. And we made a fairly good sound, and we made a recording. Ant wrote a song called Pennsylvania Flick House. Ant was way ahead in terms of composing. You know, he was a real giant of the early days, and it's hard to remember how important he was, you know, with the fullness of time. But he wrote this song, which was you can hear it on YouTube. In fact, if you just put Pennsylvania Flick House into YouTube, it's there. And we hired an hour of studio time at a place called Tony Pike Sound in Putney. We piled all the gear in Ant's mother's Mercedes, and got on the bus, And I thought, an hour? My God, what are we going to do with a whole hour? You know, I mean, each song's 3 minutes long. That means we're going to get about 9 songs done. You know, we just about got one done. And we had huge rows with Mr. Pike because everything was, of course, too loud. And he said, you're going to ruin my equipment, you know, all that classic stuff that went on in those days in recording studios. And anyway, we managed to produce this one song.
So you were the sort of Mick Jagger of...
I was. They used to call me MACPHAIL. Anthony Phillips to this day sends me a Christmas card. He puts on it MACPHAIL. Yes, I was the Mick Jagger character.
So is it? Am I right in saying that this is the very, very first time that Mike was recorded? Mike Rutherford.
Absolutely. But after that, both Rivers and I left the school. We'd done our O-levels and failed miserably, and we went elsewhere. And so that left Ant and Mike. Essentially, they got together with Peter and Tony and started writing together. And that's basically how it got started. There was a guy at school who was really nifty with tape recorders called Brian Roberts, and he recorded a demo. And amongst others, of course, they sent it to Jonathan King. And it didn't, because of the Charterhouse connection, no doubt, from his point of view, it didn't go in the slush pile. He thought there was potential. And thus the first album, from Genesis to Revelation, got made. So that's how that all happened. And then we get to 1969. And it's the point, really, where what we would now call the time for the gap year, although we didn't call it that back then. And Tony was already at Sussex University. Peter was going to go to film school. Quite interesting, the idea of Peter becoming a film director. But there was that, you know, sliding door moment. And so everybody basically decided to take a year off. At this point, the band have had 2 other drummers. They're on their 3rd drummer, called John Mayhew. They were going to sell it. They wanted to wait till the spring, and my dad worked for Rankovis McDougall. He got us an old bread van, and that's how it all kicked off. So that was the summer of 69, 70. You know, we did our getting it together in the country thing.
So that's quite a formative period, actually.
Very. Well, Mike's just written. He said because if it wasn't for me, we would have killed each other, and everybody knew it was this was it kind of thing. It was make or break. You know, any other time we couldn't really have done that.
I get the impression that this was a very kind of like literally the idea of. It sort of reminded me when I read Keith Richards' book of how they all stayed in some horrible flat in Earl's Court.
Lou Oldham locked Mick and Keith in a flat in Kilburn and wouldn't let them out of the room until they'd written a song. What they wrote was "As Tears Go By," which is, you know, anyway, that's another story. But yes, it was exactly like that. And the truth is that they hadn't really written together as much until then, a bit, but the whole way that they worked together and created the music evolved at the cottage, because what people did is that they called them bits. They would come up with someone would say, look, I've got this bit. And often from Mike and Ant's point of view, it was often around an unusual tuning of the guitars, or like 12-string. They love that jangly 12-string sound, the two of them together. And so that's how the thing sort of, the germination. And they would bring a bit and someone else would have a bit. Steve Hackett described him as the chord king. You know, he had a real grasp of harmony and chords. And so amongst other things, he obviously provided lots of bits, and he and Peter wrote together as well. But he was brilliant at joining the bits together, you know, knowing how you got from here to there. You know, and you look at like a piece like Supper's Ready, which came a little later, you know, it's just a succession of bits, good bits, and brilliantly, you know, joined together. And that's really what got started at the cottage, yeah.
So what they were working on was the record that came after Genesis to Revelation, came after the Jonathan King period, and this was the kind of make or break attempt.
Yeah.
to kind of-
Was what became Trespass. So it was Stagnation, The Knife, all that stuff. Looking for someone.
Now, this is quite interesting because with Jonathan King, we had a series of potential 3-minute songs,
Yes.
but potential hits. I mean, Jonathan
Yes.
King was looking for hits.
Yes.
All he was interested in.
That's right.
You know, and he's very good at that.
Yes.
But once the break with King came, the band it's almost like a total reversal.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things about that. Firstly, we are now at the beginning of what became English prog rock. Secondly, I think Tony, in particular, one of his great influences is hymns. And, you know, as I said, his facility with unusual chords, you know, he was not a blues man, you know, and he definitely was interested in making music, as he always has been and still does. He wanted to push the envelope out, so he brought that to it. And I think also, and this I'm quoting Mike Rutherford here, long songs are much easier than short songs. You know, to write songs like the Beatles and ABBA did is brilliant. It's genius. And, you know, maybe that came later. You know, after Phil left and perhaps Steve, you know, there were hit singles and, you know, they got better at it. But, you know, basically putting together the bits was easier. So I think that's the kind of context.
Do you remember the were there discussions about this, or did, you know, take the Looking for Someone,
Yeah.
the first track of Trespass,
Yeah.
where it starts off with a very clear voice from Peter,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
You think that it's going to be possibly a sort of soulful,
Yeah.
but then it develops
Yeah.
instrumentally.
Goes off all over the shop, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, I know. And of course, that's Peter's great influence was soul. You know, look at Sledgehammer. It's basically a soul tune. You know, that's you know, he loved Nina Simone and Otis Redding. I mean, that was the really cool thing. I mean, first of all, I mean, what was unusual is that apart from John Mayhew, they were all writers. You know, you look at most bands, you know, it's Lennon McCartney, it's Jagger Richards, you know, so, and the others, you know, but they were all writers. So, and time has shown as strong as each other. And even when Phil came along, you know, initially, you know, you know, I remember talking to him about the process of writing the music, and he would talk about how, you know, the dynamics of how it would all work with Steve and Mike and Peter and Tony, and then he'd say, well, what shall I do? And Tony would just say, well, you just drum, you know. But of course, he was an unbelievably musical drummer, and it was a very dynamic process. You know, as I said, and everyone else has said, there was lots of storming out and all of that. I mean, generally, you know, we were all public school boys, so things would be kind of a bit bottled, you know, and then when they did blow, it was fairly, you know, volcanic. So it was a very dynamic process. But I don't think they sat down and kind of worked out how they were going to do it. I think it just evolved quite naturally. No. I'm just saying this from observing. You know, you should ask them. I'm interested to know what they say.
Oh yeah, I've asked them. Well, I'm interested in your perspective because it's slightly different.
Yes.
That you're not the musician.
No.
But you're incredibly close to it.
Yes.
You lived in the house. I mean.
Well, that was the other thing that I wanted to say at that time was we talked about Peter's influences and Tony's. You know, the range of influences was huge, and a lot of it. I mean, I was very fortunate in that my sister married a scientist who's a sort of genius guy, and he built me a stereo amplifier, and I was the first person of anybody. And with headphones, you know, it was literally mind-blowing playing a piece of music to people with stereo headphones. If you haven't heard that before, it was a big influence. And so, you know, I was into There was a band called Love, Forever Changes, and Fairport Convention, Family. There's a whole range of bands that I was really into, and I kind of brought that to the party, and so they became part of the mix, because obviously when you start out, you tend to mimic who you like, and then you grow into your own. But the range of influences was very wide. Right from Tony loved Shostakovich and sort of all that era of classical music, late 19th, early 20th century, to Peter soul, and Ant loved the jangly guitar things, and so that's what made it special, amongst other things. Apart from the fact they're very talented.
Was there any kind of core theme in these arguments? We won't call them fights; we'll call them argument. These are gentlemen from Charterhouse. Was there a kind of theme? I mean, did you, maybe with hindsight, did you see Peter being more of the songwriter, lyric writer, and the others more as the core musicians?
I think that was the case. I think the song would be worked out in the crucible with all of them bringing their bits to the party, and then often then Peter would write the words. Yes, that changed later, notwithstanding the fact that Peter left, so someone had to write the words. So, but in those days, he was the principal lyric writer. I very well remember one afternoon I don't know where everyone else was, but I was making the supper, and Peter was at the organ writing the words to the lyrics to The Knife. And I was rather shocked, actually, at how violent they were. It was all about violent revolution. And, Peter being such a sort of mild-mannered, very shy kind of guy, it was through his words, these other parts of him would emerge. Yes. But it's also important to say, I think, at this point, if we're back at the cottage with Trespass, is how important Anthony Phillips was. He really was, as I say, he was a step or two ahead, I would say, in terms of composing, and the others were kind of catching up, to the degree that when he announced that he was going to leave, which was the summer of 1970, after Trespass got made, it was a serious question as to whether they would go on, and I remember very clearly we were playing at the Marquee, and there's a mews at the back of the Marquee where you'd park the van and load the equipment in, and so the gear was all on stage and the other band were playing, and I was in the back of the van with Mike, Peter and Tony, the four of us, and it seemed to me that the way it was going is that they were going to say, okay, well, we did this year, we signed with Charisma, we made an album, but without Ant, maybe we don't want to go on. And I just said, you must go on. You absolutely must. It's too good. And we can get another guitarist, so on and so forth. Wasn't easy. Took a few months for Steve to show up. But, that's how important Ant was, that they almost considered not going on after he announced that he was going to quit.
Did you ascertain from Ant's behaviour or the things he was saying that before this announcement?
Two things happened. He developed absolutely debilitating stage fright. And, it was... I remember we played in a college in Hackney, and God knows how many people were in the audience, but you could count, that. And he was catatonic, it was just one of those things that happened. And essentially, he's not played live to this day, virtually. And the second thing is that, not unconnected, he got glandular fever, and he really needed to rest. I think he found life on the road just too stressful. And of course, he's gone on to build an incredibly successful career, but he does it all in the studio, which he has at home, and he's done very well.
Was that something that you picked up?
Yeah, I could see it coming. You know, he was just finding it a real struggle. And I mean, he was my best friend in the band back then, because he and I had an on together, you know. So, and I mean, I suppose really, I may have had my moments of doubt, but I was pretty clear that it was worth going on without him, you know. So I was glad that I had my chance to put that point of view.
What you can remember what the others were saying, and what did Peter say?
I don't remember specifically, but the tone of that meeting is, it looked more likely that they were going to not continue than that they would, and so I just put my point of view very strongly, saying, you must. It's too good to give up. So it seemed to, coming from outside, you know, it seemed to be the thing enough to push them over to carrying on.
Can you tell us a bit about the arrival of Steve? What was Steve?
Well, when we had that meeting in the back of the van, at the back of the marquee, and they decided to go on, Banks said, if we're going to go on, we got to get another drummer. So basically, 2/3 of the band, you know, fell away. And so the first job was to get another drummer. And the advert went in the Melody Maker. No names. Phil knew Strat. And I think they met in one of those drinking clubs in Soho or something where everybody used to hang out. And Strat said, one of my bands needs a drummer, you might be interested. So he answered the advert. We set up at Peter's parents' house, Deep Pool in Chobham, and it was a summer and the windows were all open, and again, you know, the carpet was rolled back in the living room and the band, it was all set up. And I think Phil was about third or fourth of the drummers on the list. And typical Phil, he arrived 2 hours early. You know, that's just him to a T. And he always used to come in the van with us, because we had a transit, 2 roadies, so there was space in the van for one person. And Peter had a Hillman Imp, which is a small car that 4 people could travel in. And he always used to come with us because he wanted to get there and set up his kit and start playing. He couldn't get there quick enough. So he came and they said, can you just sort of wait by the pool? So, of course, he heard the other auditions. So he came in, you know, sat down, wrong way round. Very annoying because he's left-handed, so none of us could play his drums because it was all the wrong, you know, just it's a great thing for him. And he just, you know, so...
It wasn't just that he had heard all the others.
It was that helped, but, of course, you know, boom, it wouldn't have mattered if he hadn't heard it. He still would have got the gig. But, you know, but it's kind of typical of him. You know, that's you know, he would do that. He didn't do it on purpose. He was just keen. And it gave him an advantage. Not that I don't think he needed it. I mean, later we went on to rehearse at what is now the Maltings in Farnham, because that's where Mike's parents lived. And the first 2 days, it was just Mike teaching him the songs. And I was sleeping on the floor down there. And of this place, it was a bit sort of semi-derelict, but it served its purpose. I didn't know that you could do that with the drums. It's quite extraordinary, absolutely amazing. And of course, the music had a lot of, you know, there was time changes all the time, you know, and all these fast bits, and then it would, you know, all of that. And he just was a natural. So at the same time, we were trying to find a guitarist. Phil was in a band called Flaming Youth prior to this, and the guitarist was a friend of his, Ronnie, and he he joined the band for a couple of gigs, but he wasn't really right. But in fact, I think Phil was so good that we could actually gig as a 4-piece without a guitarist, and we had Ant's amp on the stage right, and we just had a long cable that Tony would connect into with a electric piano, and he basically did the guitar parts on the electric piano.
How long would that last?
It's probably a few weeks. There was another guy called Mick Barnard who joined. It was good, but wasn't quite right. And then Steve came along. You know, he loved King Crimson and he loved jazz stuff, and he loved the 12-string acoustic-y thing. So Mike and he just melded together. But he's also a brilliant lead player. So it really went clunk with that. And
yeah, interesting. Different. So we say the sort of social grouping was now quite different. In a way.
Yeah,
You've got
very.
The two new guys who
Yeah.
weren't public school guys.
No, well, Phil's very funny about this. You know, he did, I'm sure. You know, he when he talks about what it was like, you know, joining these public school boys. You know, he'd never really kind of been around it. It was a bit of a shock. But you know, he was a great leavening, you know, thing, because he's a wonderful sense of humour, and we would laugh a lot. Plus, he introduced me personally to some incredible music, because the other reason he liked to come in the van is that I had a cassette player in the van, you know, and it was the time when they were fairly unusual. And he would make these amazing mixtapes of the stuff that he was into, things like John McLaughlin, you know, and I really got turned on to a lot of great music thanks to Phil from that.
What about Steve? Because Steve's a different character from Phil.
Very, yeah. He's very quiet and introverted, but an amazingly strong musician. And it was amazing how quickly he fitted in. You know, it was extraordinary. Yeah. So Steve, he's very, very strong musically, but in terms of the other dynamics, you know, he as I say, he's quite introverted. So. It just really clicked, that band, you know, and some might say that's when they produced their best work, you know, right through. So that would be Foxtrot, Sailing England, and The Lamb, really. Yeah. And then when they made Supper's Ready, I remember I got a cassette from the studio, and, you know, it was a bit like a sort of religious observance, you know, we would listen to it every day, you know, wherever, you know, no talking in the van, you know, and it was a huge jump forward, in my opinion. And as I say, the production was really good. I felt like they captured the power of the band. Foxtrot
was written in Mike's parents' house. Where was that written?
Mostly at Tony Stratton Smith's house in Sussex, Crowborough. I mean, essentially, those years, there was quite a shape to the year. The summer would be off. We'd go down to Crowborough, write the next album, go in the studio, and from sort of September, October or so, and then go on the road, November through till March, April the next year, you know, and touring the album. And that was the kind of shape of things. Actually, I think, with hindsight, it's much better to take music on the road before you record it. You know, it puts a polish on it, it hones it, and you know, you get a feeling much better for what works, what doesn't work, as it were. But we didn't have the luxury of that. We just had to go straight into the studio and off we'd go. Yeah. There's a famous Van der Graaf album cover taken down there in Crowborough at Strat's house. Yeah. But I was still chief cook and bottle washer down there too.
So Supper's Ready. Do you remember that being created in the creative process? Do you remember that?
Yes. the writing had started. The thing back then is that we didn't do, rarely did we actually do tours. There were the famous 6 shilling tours that Strat put on, with us first, then Van der Graaf and Lindisfarne topping the bill. And we played all the big town halls, and they cost whatever 6 shillings is in 30p, you know, and it was that was cheap even then, you know, and it was a great exposure. Other than that, we just did gigs. You know, we had an agent, Terry King, and the gigs would come in, and there were days off. And on days off, I would set up the gear typically at, there's a studio up in West Hampstead, actually run by a guy called Rod Mayle, who was John Mayall's younger brother. And so 9 o'clock, set the gear up, band would arrive, I'd go off with the other roadies to buy drumsticks, you know, get the microphones repaired because Peter would smash them, you know, tambourines, all just repair and maintenance stuff. And then 4 o'clock I'd go back, and quite often, for instance, the musical box, you know, which was Nursery Crime, they said, well, we just finished this new song, so I sat down and they played it, you know, and it was a big moment, and special. And the same thing with the beginnings of Supper's Ready and stuff. So, in fact, the first time I heard Supper's Ready was at a dance studio, which is only down the road from here in Shepherd's Bush, that we got through Phil's connection with the world of theatre and dance, because his mum ran a stage school. And so I do remember hearing those things for the first time, thinking, this is going somewhere, you know. It's never going to be in the top 10 singles, but, you know, it was the whole side of an album. Madness.
And this is the period of Peter in costume.
He'd started to do the costume thing, yeah. That was a funny story, though, because we were playing in this boxing stadium in Dublin, and he got hold of the red dress and the fox's head. He'd had them made, and I don't know if he told anyone.
So you had no idea that he was going to be doing this?
No,
first time.
I certainly didn't know.
Was he very secretive about it? He didn't talk?
Well, yeah, because I think he thought it was a good idea, and he didn't want anybody to you know, crush it. And it's funny though with the musical box, because just the end of last year I went to see Steve Hackett at the Albert Hall, and he played the musical box, and it had exactly the same reaction to the way it always did. It's an amazing song, and it has an incredible ending, and it always had that effect. But it was even more so because ultimately he moved on and he did the old man thing, because it's, you know, it's about that somebody going from a little boy to an old man, and so that it was always a fantastic song that people just loved. Yeah.